For nearly 20 years, the parents of Madeleine McCann have endured a torment that most of us cannot even imagine. But recently, they were forced to face a new, unprecedented cruelty. A voice emerged from the shadows of the internet with a claim that stopped the world in its tracks. I want to know who I am. And want to know if I am Madeleine. What began as a viral mystery quickly spiraled into a dangerous obsession. It was no longer just a question. It was a siege. 60 calls in a single day. A stranger waiting in the dark at the end of their driveway. A grieving mother confronted in her own home. Was this the miracle the world had been waiting for? Or was it the dangerous delusion of a woman losing her grip on reality when the police stepped in and the D&C results finally came back? The truth was absolute. From the viral fame to the prison cell, this is the complete story of the Phantom Daughter. But before we descend into this twisting mystery, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. It helps us bring these investigations to light. Now, let us open the file. For nearly 20 years, the silence has been the loudest thing in the room. It is a heavy, suffocating silence that settled over a family home in Leicestershire almost 2 decades ago, and despite the passage of time, it has never truly lifted. To understand the horror of what is about to unfold in this story, one must first understand the specific, agonizing purgatory in which Kate and Gary McCann have lived since that fateful spring evening in Portugal. Most families who suffer a tragedy are eventually granted the mercy of a conclusion. There is a funeral, a grave to visit, a final police report, or a verdict in a courtroom. Grief, while terrible, usually has a shape. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But for the parents of Madeleine, grief is a circle. It is a concept psychologists call ambiguous loss. They are trapped in a frozen moment, suspended between hope and despair, unable to fully grieve a child who might still be alive, yet unable to find peace because she is gone. For the first 17 years, their torment came from the unknown. It came from the emptiness of a bedroom left unchanged, the birthday presents bought and wrapped, but never opened, and the endless grinding machinery of a global police investigation that spanned continents but yielded no physical person. The world watched them age. The public saw the lines of worry deepen on their faces during televised anniversaries. The world saw their other children, the twins, grow from youngsters into adults, graduating and building lives of their own. But behind the closed doors of their home in the English countryside, the missing piece of their family remained a constant, aching void. They learned to build an armor against the outside world. Over the years, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of false leads. There were sightings in Morocco, whispers in Spain, and blurry photographs taken by well-meaning tourists in Belgium. Each time a phone rang or a detective knocked on their door, their hearts would hammer against their ribs, only to be broken again when the lead turned to dust. They developed a survival mechanism, cautious skepticism. They learned not to let hope rise too high, lest the fall destroy them completely. But nothing in those 2 decades of disappointment could have prepared them for the cruelty that began to emerge 3 years ago. The threats they were used to came from the shadows, captors, criminals, the unknown darkness of the night. They were not prepared for a threat that would step into the harsh light of social media, demanding to be seen. The nature of the world had changed since their daughter vanished. When Madeleine vanished, the internet was a different place. It was slower, smaller, and less intrusive. But as the years turned into decades, the digital landscape shifted. It became a place where rumors could travel faster than truth, and where anyone with a smartphone could broadcast a fantasy to millions of people instantly. The barriers between reality and delusion began to dissolve. In this modern era, the torture did not come from a lack of information, but from an overload of it. The family had faced tabloid speculation and harsh public judgment, but they had never faced a phantom quite like this. This new torment did not come from a criminal hiding in the dark. It came from a young woman standing in the spotlight, holding up a mirror and claiming that the reflection belonged to them. It began slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. It was not a sudden explosion, but a creeping unease. Somewhere in Poland, a narrative was being constructed. It was a narrative born from a troubled mind, but it found fertile ground in the chaotic ecosystem of online sleuths and conspiracy theorists. This was not a sighting of their daughter. This was someone claiming to be their daughter. For Kate and Gary, the distinction was terrifying. A sighting is something you can investigate and dismiss. A person claiming identity is something personal, something that invades the very biological essence of the family. It strikes at the core of a mother's memory and a father's protection. This was not just a false lead. It was an identity theft of the highest emotional order. The peace of their quiet village life, which they had fought so hard to maintain for the sake of the twins, was about to be shattered not by news of a discovery, but by the arrival of a ghost. This ghost was not silent. She was loud, she was persistent, and she was armed with an army of internet followers who believed her every word. The parents had spent nearly 20 years looking for their little girl. They were searching for a child. What they were about to face was a grown woman carrying a lifetime of her own trauma, projecting it onto their tragedy. As the whispers from the internet grew into a roar that crossed the English Channel, the McCanns realized that the nightmare was no longer just about the child they lost. It was about the stranger who was coming to find them. The torment was about to evolve. The ambiguous loss was ending, replaced by a very specific, targeted harassment. The phone in their kitchen, which had sat silent for so long, was about to start ringing. And ringing. And ringing. The unending silence was over, but the noise that replaced it would prove to be a different kind of hell. While the family in England lay trapped under the heavy blanket of their silent grief, 1,000 miles away in Poland, a storm was beginning to brew inside the mind of a young woman named Julia. To the outside world, she was simply a 21-year-old navigating the complexities of early adulthood, but internally she was adrift in a sea of confusion and trauma. Julia was not a villain in the traditional sense, at least not in the beginning. She was a figure of tragedy, a person whose grip on her own identity had become dangerously slippery. Her life before the summer of 2022 had been marked by instability. She carried the heavy baggage of a difficult childhood, marred by moments of deep distress and painful experiences that she struggled to process. In her conversations with others, she would often speak of a profound sense of alienation, a feeling that she did not belong to the people who raised her. This is not an uncommon feeling for young people who have suffered, but for Julia, this emotional distance began to harden into a literal belief. She did not just feel like an outsider. She began to suspect that she was biologically unconnected to her family. The human mind is a powerful instrument of survival. When reality becomes too painful to bear, the mind can sometimes construct a new reality, a protective narrative where the pain has a grander purpose. For Julia, the gaps in her memory became the canvas for this new reality. She claimed that large portions of her childhood were missing, erased by a fog that she could not penetrate. Instead of seeing this amnesia as a consequence of trauma, she saw it as a mystery waiting to be solved. She possessed a birth certificate, photographs, and the testimony of her mother and father, but she rejected them all. In her eyes, these documents were forgeries and her memories were lies. It was in June of 2022 that this fragility crystallized into a specific obsession. The catalyst remains somewhat murky, a blend of internet searches and whispered suspicions, but the idea took root with terrifying speed. Julia did not just think she was a missing child. She began to believe she was the most famous missing child in the world. She turned to the mirror, and what she saw there was no longer her own reflection. She began to dissect her own face with the precision of a forensic scientist. She looked at her eyes, specifically the right one. She noticed a defect, a coloboma, a rare condition where the pupil bleeds into the iris like a tear. It is a distinctive mark, one that had been broadcast on millions of missing person posters around the globe for nearly 2 decades. Julia had a similar mark. To a rational observer, it was a coincidence, a biological quirk shared by thousands of people. But to Julia, it was a revelation. She continued her self-examination. She scanned her body for moles, comparing the blemishes on her skin to the descriptions she found online. She looked at the shape of her face, the line of her jaw, the gap in her teeth. With every perceived similarity, the wall between truth and fantasy grew thicker. She was falling victim to a powerful confirmation bias. She ignored the overwhelming evidence that she was Julia, her age, her accent, her location, and fixated entirely on the tiny fragments that suggested she could be Madeleine. This delusion offered her something that her real life could not: an explanation. If she was the missing girl from the news, then her feelings of not belonging made perfect sense. If she was a taken child, then her pain was not just misery but martyrdom. It gave her a story of significance, and most dangerously, it gave her a mission. She convinced herself that she was not running away from her problems, but running toward a hidden truth. She began to confront her family in Poland. She demanded answers about her birth questions that her parents found baffling and hurtful. They showed her pictures of her mother pregnant with her pictures of her in the hospital documents that proved her lineage. But Julia was already too far gone. She viewed their frustration as defensiveness. In her twisted logic, their refusal to agree with her was proof of a conspiracy. She believed they were hiding something, that they were part of the plot to keep her from her real parents. The isolation grew. As her family pulled away, exhausted by the accusations, Julia turned to the only place that would listen without judgment: the internet. She began to document her evidence. Equals face of the missing British child. She scrutinized the smiles, the dimples, the eye structure. She was building a case, not for a court of law, but for the court of public opinion. At this stage, Julia was still a lonely figure screaming into the void. She was scared, confused, and desperate for validation. She truly believed that she had uncovered a dark secret about her own existence. She did not yet know the chaos she was about to unleash. She was simply a girl in a room, staring at a screen, convincing herself that the face looking back at her belonged to a ghost. The idea had formed, the obsession had set in, and soon she would take the first step that would transform her private delusion into a public nightmare. The silence of her own life was unbearable, so she decided to borrow the noise of someone else's tragedy. To the wider world, Julia appeared to be a sudden phenomenon, a new voice emerging from nowhere to claim a lost identity. But behind the scenes, in the quiet offices of those who dedicate their lives to finding the lost, her name was already known. The obsession with being Madeleine was not the beginning of her story. It was merely the latest and most ambitious in a disturbing pattern of behavior. Fixed her gaze on the missing British child for a mask to wear, trying on the tragedies of other families in a desperate attempt to escape her own. Long before the international headlines, Julia had reached out to a missing persons charity in Poland. The organization was run by a woman named Ivona, a dedicated investigator who had spent years reuniting families and navigating the heartbreaking complexities of cold cases. Ivona was accustomed to receiving tips, leads, and pleas for help. She was used to the desperate hope of parents and the confusion of those who felt lost. But when she first encountered Julia, she sensed something different. This was not a young woman seeking to be found. This was a young woman seeking to be someone else entirely. Julia did not approach the charity with questions. She approached them with assertions. She arrived with a binder of information, a collection of proofs that she had meticulously assembled. However, what Ivona discovered was not a breakthrough in a cold case, but a revolving door of identities. It was revealed that Madeleine was not the first missing child Julia had claimed to be. She was the third. In the months prior, Julia had identified herself as two other missing children, one from Germany and another from a different region. In each instance, the pattern was identical. She would scour the internet for high-profile cases of missing persons who would be roughly her age. She would study their facial features, memorize the details of their disappearances, and then convince herself that she was the one in the photograph. It was a cycle of adoption and rejection. When one identity failed to gain traction or was disproven by basic logic, she did not return to being Julia. Instead, she simply moved on to the next candidate, searching for a story that was big enough to contain her pain. Ivona and her team looked into Julia's background with professional rigor. They spoke to her family, reviewed her medical history, and examined the documents she claimed were forged. The conclusion was immediate and absolute. Ivona told her explicitly that there was zero possibility of her being these missing children. She explained that the timelines did not match, that the physical evidence was non-existent, and that her biological family in Poland had provided irrefutable proof of her origin. Most people, when presented with such stark reality by an expert, would retreat. They would accept the truth, however painful. But Julia's reaction was not one of acceptance. It was one of defiance. She had become immune to reason. When Ivona told her she was 100% not the missing British girl, Julia simply stopped listening. She viewed the charity not as a helper, but as an obstacle. In her mind, the experts were wrong, her parents were liars, and she was the only one who could see the truth. Ivona later recalled the chilling nature of Julia's determination. She noted that Julia had all the answers well prepared. Every objection was met with a counter-argument, no matter how fantastical. If the dates didn't match, the birth certificate was faked. If the eyes didn't match perfectly, the photos were altered. There was no penetrating the fortress of belief she had built around herself. What disturbed the investigators most was the motivation they sensed beneath the surface. Ivona observed that Julia did not seem to be looking for a family to love her. She seemed to be looking for an audience. There was a hunger for fame, a desire to be at the center of a narrative that the whole world was watching. The previous missing children she had claimed to be were tragic figures, but they were not global icons. Madeleine was different. To be Madeleine was to be the most famous missing person in history. It was a role that carried a gravity and a tension that Julia seemed to crave deeply. The tragedy here was twofold. There was the tragedy of the families whose missing children were being used as costumes for a troubled young woman's fantasy. And then there was the tragedy of Julia herself, a person so fundamentally unhappy with who she was that she would go to any length to erase her own existence. She wanted to be anyone but herself. The charity severed ties, refusing to indulge the delusion any further. Ivona warned her that pursuing this path would only bring pain to everyone involved. But the warning fell on deaf ears. Having failed to convince the professionals in her own country, Julia realized she needed a new strategy. She didn't need the approval of investigators or the cooperation of charities. She had a phone, she had an internet connection, and she knew that out there in the digital world there were millions of strangers who would not ask for proof before they clicked share. She had tried being the German girl. She had tried being the other missing child. Now she was ready to cast herself in the lead role. The pattern of shadows was complete. She was done with rehearsals. She was ready to take her performance to the biggest stage of all, and the target she had chosen was a family in England who had no idea that their nightmare was about to be revived by a stranger with a smartphone and a need to be seen. When the doors of professional help and logical investigation slammed shut in Poland, Julia did not stop. Instead, she found a new door, one that was unlocked and wide open to the entire world. She turned to social media. This was the moment the story shifted from a private mental health crisis into a global spectacle. The rejection she faced from missing persons experts did not deter her. It only fueled a desperate need to find a court that would rule in her favor. She found that court on Instagram and TikTok. She created a profile with a handle that was not a question but a declaration. She did not ask if she could be the missing girl. She stated it as a fact. I am Madeleine. With those 3 words, she ignited a digital wildfire that would burn out of control for months. She began to upload the evidence. She had curated the close-up photographs of her eye, the diagrams of her moles, the comparisons of her smile next to the smile of the missing child who vanished nearly 2 decades ago. The internet is a vast, chaotic machine that runs on engagement, and Julia had accidentally stumbled upon the perfect formula for virality. The human brain is hardwired to look for patterns. It wants to solve puzzles. When presented with 2 faces side by side and told to look for similarities, the brain will find them, ignoring the differences. Julia provided the puzzle, and millions of bored, curious strangers rushed to solve it. Within weeks, her follower count exploded. It went from dozens to thousands and then to hundreds of thousands. This was the validation she had been craving. Every like, every share, and every comment telling her "I believe you" acted as a hit of dopamine, cementing the delusion in her mind. She was no longer the lonely, misunderstood girl from Poland who felt out of place in her own family. She was now a celebrity, a victim, a heroine fighting for the truth. The internet created an echo chamber where reality could not penetrate. For every one person who pointed out the obvious flaws in her story, there were 10 others cheering her on, urging her to fight and validating her fantasy. This digital army did more than just watch. They mobilized. They began to dissect the lives of the McCann family. They analyzed old photos, they spun wild conspiracy theories, and they turned their collective gaze toward the parents in England. The narrative shifted dangerously. It was no longer just about Julia's identity. It became an attack on Kate and Gary. The internet mob began to ask why the parents were staying silent. They demanded to know why the family would not simply agree to a D&C test. They twisted the parents' refusal to engage with a harasser into a sign of guilt or indifference. The momentum was unstoppable. The story crossed the Atlantic and landed on American television. Julia was invited to appear on a major talk show, a platform that gave her claims a veneer of legitimacy that they did not deserve. Sitting under the studio lights, broadcasting to millions of American homes, she repeated her story. She spoke of her foggy memories, her traumatic childhood, and her absolute conviction that she was the lost child. To the audience watching at home, she appeared vulnerable and convincing. They did not see the history of failed identity claims. They did not know about the rejection from the Polish charity. They only saw a young woman crying out for answers. The television appearance acted as a super accelerant. It took a viral internet trend and turned it into a mainstream news story. Julia was now fully immersed in the role. She had agents, she had a press representative, and she had the attention of the world. The line between her true self and the persona she had created was completely erased. She was relentlessly hounding the McCann family, not just with private messages, but with the weight of global media pressure. She used interviews to issue challenges to the parents, looking directly into the camera to demand their biological material. The tragedy of this was the democratization of the investigation. Suddenly, everyone with a smartphone believed they were a detective. The complex, painful reality of a police investigation was replaced by internet sleuths drawing red circles on screenshots. Julia fed this machine, daily posting updates, emotional pleas, and angry denunciations of anyone who doubted her. She had achieved her objective. She was famous. She was the center of conversation in 3 continents. But in doing so, she had unleashed a torrent of harassment upon a family that had already suffered the ultimate loss. The digital wildfire was consuming everything in its path: truth, logic, and privacy, leaving only the scorched earth of a sensationalist lie. The internet had promised to help her find herself, but instead, it helped her lose her grip on reality completely. The digital storm that had been raging across the internet finally made landfall in the physical world, crashing directly into the sanctuary of the family home in Leicestershire. For weeks, the parents had tried to maintain the buffer between their private lives and the public hysteria, but that barrier was about to be obliterated. The harassment shifted from public posts on social media to a direct, piercing intrusion into their daily existence. The tool of this torture was the telephone, a device that had once been a lifeline for news, but had now become an instrument of terror. It began with a trickle, a few missed calls from an unknown number, a voicemail left in a heavily accented, trembling voice. But very quickly, the trickle turned into a deluge. The frequency of the contact became manic. On the worst days, the phone would ring up to 60 times within a single 24-hour period. It was a relentless electronic heartbeat of obsession that refused to be silenced. The family could not unplug the phone. They were parents of a missing child, and the agonizing possibility that a legitimate police call might come through meant the line had to stay open. Julia, whether she realized it or not, was exploiting this specific vulnerability. She knew they had to listen. The content of these messages was a disturbing oscillation between desperation and aggression. Sometimes the voice on the other end was childlike and pleading, begging mom and dad to acknowledge her. She would leave long, rambling voicemails detailing supposed childhood memories that the family knew were impossible, yet were delivered with chilling conviction. She spoke of moments that never happened, of a shared past that existed only in her mind, trying to overwrite the reality of their actual lives with her fabricated history. At other times, the tone would darken. When her pleas were met with the silence of a family trying to protect itself, the sorrow would turn to rage. She would demand to know why they were rejecting her. She would accuse them of cruelty, asking why they did not want their daughter back. For Kate and Gary, hearing a stranger's voice accused them of abandoning their own child, the child they had spent every waking moment of the last 2 decades grieving and searching for, was a psychological assault of the highest order. It was a twisting of the knife that had been lodged in their hearts since 2007. This barrage was not limited to audio. The digital intrusion escalated into a visual bombardment. Julia began sending images directly to the family and their inner circle. These were not just photographs. They were doctored manipulations. She would take pictures of herself and digitally merge them with images of the missing girl or with photos of the parents themselves. She would circle features, the eyes, the chin, the ears, and demand that the family admit to the resemblance. It was a form of gaslighting, a relentless attempt to force them to see what she saw, to break down their resistance through sheer repetition. The impact of this campaign extended beyond the parents. It reached the siblings, the twins, who were now young adults trying to forge their own identities in the shadow of their sister's disappearance. Amelie, the sister of the missing girl, would later describe the profound distress this caused. To have a stranger aggressively claim to be the sister she had lost, to have false memories projected onto her family, was a violation of their shared history. It destabilized the fragile peace they had built. Every time the phone rang, the anxiety in the house would spike. Was it her again? What would she say this time? This was no longer a young woman looking for answers. This was a stalker demanding submission. Julia had ceased to be a passive figure waiting to be discovered. She had become an active aggressor invading the sanctity of the home. She believed she was fighting for her identity, but to the family on the receiving end, she was a nightmare that refused to wake up. The sheer volume of the contact 60, calls 60, demands 60 interruptions of their peace in a single day, made it impossible to ignore. She was not just asking for a D&C test, she was trying to force a surrender. The silence of the house, once a symbol of their loss, was now filled with the chaotic noise of her delusion, and the walls of their privacy were crumbling under the weight of the attack. The relentless electronic siege upon the family home had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a matter of curiosity or a misguided quest for identity. It had mutated into a criminal matter. The barrage of 60 calls a day, the voicemails, and the doctored images had stripped away the veneer of innocence from Julia's campaign. In the eyes of the law, this was harassment, plain and simple. The family in Leicestershire, exhausted and besieged, had no choice but to rely on the authorities to intervene. The silence they had maintained was not working. It was time for the law to speak. The intervention came from the Metropolitan Police. This was significant. The force that had spent years managing the delicate and high-profile investigation into the disappearance was now forced to pivot its resources to manage the woman claiming to be the victim. A specific officer was tasked with the difficult job of piercing the bubble of Julia's delusion. This was not a counseling session or a debate. It was a formal police warning intended to stop the behavior before it escalated into physical danger. The officer reached out to Julia directly. The conversation that followed was stark and uncompromising. The authorities had reviewed the facts, they had seen the evidence, and they had communicated with the relevant agencies. The message delivered to Julia was absolute. The officer told her in no uncertain terms that she was not Madeleine McCann. There was no ambiguity in his voice, no room left for interpretation. He dismantled the fantasy with a single sentence, stripping away the layers of internet conspiracy theories to present the cold, hard reality. But the officer went further. He did not just correct her identity, he warned her about her future actions. He explicitly addressed the possibility of her traveling to the United Kingdom. He told her that if she were to go to Leicester, if she were to approach the family or their home, she would be crossing a legal red line. He used the specific legal terminology, explaining that there is an offense called harassment. He made it clear that her digital actions were already bordering on criminal, but a physical presence would result in immediate consequences. If you cause any harassment, he warned her, you could be arrested. For any rational person, a direct warning from a major police force carrying the threat of arrest and imprisonment would be the end of the road. It would be the moment where the fog lifts, replaced by the fear of prosecution. But Julia was no longer operating within the bounds of rational decision-making. The warning did not act as a deterrent. It acted as a challenge. Her response to the officer was chilling in its defiance. She did not apologize. She did not agree to step back. Instead, she met the threat of arrest with a declaration of war. She told the officer, "I will never give up." This was not a throwaway comment. It was a manifesto. To her, the police were not protectors of the peace. They were merely another obstacle in her path, another group of people trying to keep her from her parents. The officer, realizing the depth of her fixation, acknowledged her stubbornness with a resigned, "I know you won't." The call ended, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The warning had failed. Instead of extinguishing the fire, the police intervention seemed to pour gasoline on it. By telling her she could not go to Leicester, they had inadvertently solidified her resolve to do exactly that. Julia interpreted the warning not as a legal boundary, but as a test of her commitment. In her mind, the forces of the world were aligning against her to hide the truth, and she was the lone warrior fighting to reveal it. The threat of arrest did not scare her. It validated her self-image as a martyr. She believed she was willing to go to prison to prove who she was. This moment marked the dangerous transition from a digital harasser to a physical threat. The safety of the internet was no longer enough for her. The phone calls were no longer enough. The police had drawn a line in the sand, and Julia was already lacing up her shoes to step over it. She was done talking to officers and voicemails. She decided that if the family would not answer the phone and if the police would not help her, she would have to stand on their doorstep and force them to see her. The warning had been issued, but it had gone unheeded, and the countdown to a physical confrontation had begun. Up until this point, Julia had been fighting a solitary war. She was a lone figure, standing against the weight of biological evidence, police warnings, and public skepticism. To the vast majority of the world, she was a troubled young woman lost in a labyrinth of her own making. But the internet is a vast place, and in its darkest corners, one can always find someone willing to validate even the most impossible ideas. Julia needed more than just followers who clicked a button. She needed a believer who would take action. She found that person in a woman named Karen. The introduction of Karen marked a critical and dangerous turning point in the narrative. Before Karen, Julia's campaign was limited by her own resources and her own isolation. She was a young woman with little money and no logistical support, shouting into the digital void. Karen changed the equation entirely. She was not a passive observer. She was a woman who saw the unfolding drama, not as a tragedy to be watched from afar, but as an opportunity to insert herself into the center of a global mystery. Karen emerged from the ranks of online supporters, but she quickly distinguished herself from the casual commenters. While others offered words of encouragement or theories, Karen offered tangible, real-world assistance. She became a confidant, a mentor, and eventually the financier of the delusion. The psychology of such an enabler is complex. By aligning herself with Julia, Karen moved from the audience to the stage. She became a key player in the story of the missing girl, a role that carried a seductive weight of importance. She was no longer just a spectator. She was the self-appointed guardian of the truth. The relationship between the two women developed rapidly. To Julia, Karen was a savior. Here was an adult, a woman of means who did not dismiss her claims as madness. Karen listened. She nodded, and most importantly, she affirmed. When the police told Julia she was wrong and when her family begged her to stop, Karen told her she was right. She fed the fire that everyone else was trying to extinguish. In the echo chamber of their communication, the plan to confront the family in England began to take shape. The transition from digital support to physical action was facilitated by money. Delusions are often limited by reality, but money has a way of bypassing those limits. Karen opened her wallet. She paid for the flights that would bring them together. She paid for the hotels that would house them. She provided the logistical framework that turned a fantasy into an expedition. Without Karen, Julia might have remained a voice on a screen trapped by geography and a lack of funds. With Karen, Julia became a mobile threat. This partnership was symbiotic but toxic. Julia provided the raw material of the drama, the tears, the claims, the resemblance, while Karen provided the direction and the means. It is difficult to say whether Karen truly believed Julia was the missing child or if she simply became addicted to the thrill of the chase. Regardless of her internal belief, her external actions were decisive. She validated Julia's rejection of the police warning. She reinforced the idea that the authorities were incompetent, and that only they, the two of them, could solve the mystery. They began to plot their journey to Leicestershire. This was no longer a vague ambition. It was a scheduled itinerary. They were not going as tourists. They were going as investigators convinced that they had a moral right to disrupt the lives of the McCann family. Karen's presence emboldened Julia. It is scary to break the law alone. It is much easier to do it when you have a partner telling you that you are a hero. The fear of arrest that the police officer had tried to instill was replaced by the confidence of a shared mission. The decision was made. They would travel to the heart of the mystery. They would go to the village where the family lived. They would ignore the restraining orders, the warnings, and the common decency that had kept the rest of the world at bay. Karen had effectively handed a loaded weapon to a person who did not know how to use it and then offered to drive the getaway car. The solo act was over. The duet had begun, and they were moving toward a confrontation that would shatter the peace of a family that had already endured too much. The digital phantom was about to step off the screen and walk the streets of Leicester, and she was bringing a sponsor with her. The plan had moved from the digital realm into the physical world. The keystrokes and video uploads were replaced by boarding passes and train tickets. Julia and Karen were no longer just voices on the internet. They were travelers in transit moving steadily toward a destination that represented the epicenter of a 20-year-old's sorrow. The journey to Leicester was not merely a trip across geography. It was a transgression across the boundaries of privacy and decency. They left the continent behind, crossing the channel that separates mainland Europe from the island nation of the United Kingdom. For Julia, this movement was loaded with immense psychological weight. She believed she was not traveling to a foreign country but returning home. Every mile covered was a reinforcement of her delusion. She convinced herself that the landscape outside the window might trigger a lost memory, that the air would smell familiar, that her body would recognize the soil of her true birthland. It was a pilgrimage fueled by a lie. Karen, the facilitator, moved with a different kind of purpose. She was the manager of this expedition. She handled the logistics, ensuring that their movement was smooth and for the moment unnoticed by the authorities who had warned them to stay away. There was a sense of covert operation to their travel. They knew they were defying the explicit instructions of the Metropolitan Police. They knew that simply by setting foot in Leicestershire with the intent to contact the family, they were courting arrest. But the thrill of the mission seemed to outweigh the risk. They were operating in a bubble of self-righteousness, convincing themselves that the rules did not apply to them because their cause was just. They arrived in the region not as guests, but as infiltrators. They chose a hotel strategically located near the village where the McCann family lived. The choice of accommodation was not about comfort, it was about proximity. They needed a base of operations, a staging ground from which they could launch their final approach. As they checked in, the mundane act of handing over credit cards and receiving room keys was charged with a sinister undercurrent. To the hotel staff, they were just two women traveling together. To the family living just a few miles away, they were an approaching storm. Once inside the hotel room, the atmosphere shifted from travel to preparation. This was the war room. They did not spend their time sightseeing or enjoying the local culture. Instead, they focused entirely on their target. They mapped out the geography of the village. They identified the specific streets, the layout of the neighborhood, and the probable routines of the people they had come to confront. The internet, which had been their stage, now became their tactical tool. They used online maps and street views to familiarize themselves with the terrain, turning the family's neighborhood into a grid to be navigated. The tension in that hotel room must have been palpable. On one side, there was Julia vibrating with a mix of anxiety and manic hope. She was hours away from facing the people she believed were her parents. She likely rehearsed what she would say, playing out scenarios in her head where they would see her, recognize her instantly, and embrace her with tears of joy. It was a fantasy of reunion that ignored the harsh reality of the harassment she had inflicted. On the other side was Karen, the enabler, who had brought this fantasy to the doorstep of reality. She was the anchor keeping Julia focused, perhaps reassuring her when the nerves threatened to overwhelm. They were a team bound by a shared obsession, feeding off each other's energy. The doubts of the outside world could not reach them here. In the isolation of the hotel room, their mission felt logical, necessary, and inevitable. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, signaling the approach of evening, the waiting game ended. They were not there to sleep. They were there to act. They prepared to leave the safety of the hotel and venture into the village. The journey that had started with a thought in Poland, grown into a hashtag on the internet, and traveled across international borders, was now measured in mere miles. The distance between the phantom daughter and the grieving parents had shrunk to almost nothing. The car was ready. The map was set. They stepped out into the English evening, leaving the realm of speculation behind to force a collision with reality. The car moved slowly through the quiet streets of the village, a foreign object navigating the veins of a community that had long ago learned to guard its privacy. Julia and Karen were no longer traveling, they were hunting. They had entered the final radius of their obsession. The digital maps and satellite images they had studied on their screens were now replaced by the three-dimensional reality of the asphalt and the brick. They found the street they had been searching for, a place that had been etched into Julia's mind as the sanctuary she was denied. They did not park directly in front of the house. Instead, they chose a vantage point at the end of the road, positioning themselves like surveillance agents lying in wait. This was the definition of a stakeout. It was a predatory act, calculated and cold, despite the heated emotions fueling it. The two women sat in the vehicle, the engine likely silenced to avoid drawing attention, their eyes fixed on the entrance of the driveway. The disconnect between their intent and the surroundings was jarring. Around them, life was proceeding with mundane normalcy. Neighbors were likely returning from work, lights were flickering on in living rooms, and the rhythm of a Tuesday evening was playing out. But inside the car, the atmosphere was tight with the anticipation of a raid. Julia sat in the passenger seat, her gaze locked on the target. This was the closest she had ever been to the people she called mother and father. The proximity did not bring her clarity. It brought her a chaotic surge of adrenaline. In her mind, she was waiting for a reunion, but her body language betrayed the tension of an ambush. She scanned every passing car, every movement behind the curtains, looking for a sign. She was vibrating with the energy of a person who believes they are moments away from the climax of their life story. She interpreted the silence of the street not as peace, but as a barrier she had to break through. Karen sat beside her, the enabler in the driver's seat. Her role had shifted from financier to tactical partner. She was the lookout. She watched the mirrors and the road, ensuring that no police patrols were near, ensuring that their presence remained undetected until the critical moment. There was a distinct arrogance in their positioning. They knew they had been warned. They knew that a restraining order was a legal wall they were not supposed to climb. Yet they sat there believing that their mission superseded the law. They felt entitled to this space, entitled to ambush a family that had spent years begging for privacy. Time in a stakeout distorts. Minutes stretch into hours. The waiting game is a psychological test. Doubt can creep in, or resolve can harden. For Julia, the wait only served to wind the spring tighter. She rehearsed the encounter in her mind. She imagined the shock on their faces not as horror, but as recognition. She was incapable of seeing herself as a threat. She saw herself as a gift waiting to be opened. She did not understand that to the people inside the house, she was a monster born of the internet, a manifestation of their worst anxieties. The sun began to fade, completely wrapping the street in the cover of darkness. This favored them. Shadows are the natural habitat of the stalker. The darkness allowed them to see out without being seen. They watched the house as if it were a fortress to be breached. They looked for the patterns of life, the timing of the lights, the movement of shadows behind the glass. They were gathering intelligence for the confrontation. Then the waiting ended. A set of headlights swept across the darkened street, illuminating the pavement. A car turned into the driveway. The pulse of the mission quickened instantly. Julia and Karen stiffened their eyes, locking onto the vehicle. This was it. The targets were home. The abstract concept of the McCann family was now a physical reality, sitting just yards away in a metal box, unaware that they were being watched from the darkness. The unsuspecting nature of the victims is what made this moment so cruel. Kate and Gary were likely returning from a day of work, tired perhaps thinking about dinner or the evening ahead. They had let their guard down, assuming that the sanctity of their home began at the edge of their driveway. They did not know that their perimeter had already been breached. They did not know that two women were watching them with breathless anticipation, preparing to sprint across the tarmac to force a collision of worlds. Julia's hand reached for the door handle. The time for observation was over. The threshold between the watcher and the watched was about to be crossed. The silence of the street was about to be shattered by the chaotic noise of a delusion that refused to stay online. They were no longer watching from the shadows. They were stepping out of them, ready to bring their nightmare to the family's front door. The moment the headlights of the family car cut, the engine died, returning the street to a heavy silence. This was the signal. In the waiting vehicle down the road, the suspension of time shattered. There was no more planning, no more checking of maps, and no more rehearsing of lines. The gap between the digital delusion and the physical reality was about to be closed by a sprint across the tarmac. Julia moved first. She opened her car door and stepped out into the night air, her heart hammering against her ribs, with a violence that likely drowned out all other sounds. To her, this was the climax of a fairy tale, the moment the lost princess reveals herself to the grieving queen. She did not see herself as an attacker. She saw herself as a miracle. She began to run towards the driveway, her footsteps sharp and hurried against the ground. Kate McCann had just stepped out of her vehicle. She was in the sanctuary of her own home, a place that is supposed to be the one safe harbor in a world that had been cruel to her family for nearly 2 decades. She was likely tired, mentally unloading the burdens of the day, completely unprepared for the ambush that was rushing towards her from the darkness. The terror of that moment cannot be overstated. For a woman whose life had been defined by the disappearance of a child, the sound of rushing footsteps coming from behind in the dark is not a mere surprise. It is a trigger for the deepest, most primal fear imaginable. Kate felt the presence before she saw the face. She turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, closing the distance with frightening speed. Julia did not stop at a respectful distance. She invaded the personal space that separates a stranger from a threat. She was breathless, manic, and desperate. The words tumbled out of her, a chaotic mix of pleas and demands. She began to beg for a D&C test, her voice rising in the quiet street. She spoke of being the daughter, of having the memories, of needing the acknowledgement. To Kate, this was not a reunion. It was a nightmare, manifesting in flesh and blood. The woman standing before her was not her child. She was the physical embodiment of the harassment that had been plaguing their phones for months. Then the second figure arrived. Karen had followed Julia not to restrain her, but to reinforce the assault. If Julia was the desperate child, Karen was the aggressive enforcer. She stepped into the light of the motion sensor lamps that had flickered on her demeanor, confrontational and cold. She did not offer an apology for the intrusion. Instead, she delivered one of the most cruel and cutting questions ever directed at a grieving mother. Looking at Kate, who was recoiling from the shock, Karen demanded to know, "Don't you want to find your daughter?" The weaponization of that question was absolute. It took the family's greatest trauma, their desperate lifelong search, and twisted it into an accusation. It implied that their refusal to entertain the delusions of a stranger was proof of their indifference. It was a psychological blow designed to stun and shame, delivered on their own driveway in the dark by a woman who had no right to speak the name of the missing girl. The commotion drew Gary McCann into the fray. The father appeared, stepping into the chaotic scene to place himself between the intruders and his wife. The dynamic shifted instantly. The protective instinct flared. He saw exactly what was happening. Two strangers had stalked them to their home and were now haranguing them in the night. The realization of who these women were, the ones from the internet, the ones the police had warned, must have been immediate and infuriating. The confrontation was brief but explosive in its emotional intensity. The family did not engage in a debate. They did not study Julia's eyes or look at her moles. They saw only the threat. They ordered the women to leave. The command was absolute, a rejection of the entire fantasy. There was no hug, no tearful recognition, only the stark, angry reality of a family defending its perimeter against insanity. Julia and Karen, facing the wall of rejection, finally faltered. The script Julia had written in her head where her parents would weep and embrace her had dissolved. Instead, she was being cast out. The two women retreated, moving back into the shadows from which they had emerged. But as they walked away, the damage remained. The physical safety of the home had been breached. The family was left standing on the driveway, their hearts racing, the adrenaline crashing through their systems. The silence returned to the street, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the stunned silence of victims who had just survived an assault on their sanity. The encounter was over, but the violation was total. The phantom daughter had come. She had been seen, and she had left behind not hope but a fresh and terrifying scar. Most people, when confronted with the terrified anger of a family they have just ambushed, would feel a crushing sense of shame. The natural human reaction to being ordered off a property by a shouting father and a frightened mother is to flee, to put as much distance as possible between oneself and the mistake. But Julia and Karen were not operating within the boundaries of natural human reaction. They were operating within the airtight logic of a shared delusion. The rejection on the driveway did not shatter their belief. It merely frustrated their timeline. They retreated from the house, but they did not leave the village. Instead of driving away and accepting the reality that they were unwelcome strangers, they regrouped in the darkness to analyze what had gone wrong. In the twisted narrative they had constructed, the hostility of the parents was not a sign of intrusion, but a sign of confusion. Julia convinced herself that the encounter had been too brief, too chaotic. She believed that if she could just communicate with them calmly without the shouting, they would finally see the truth. She did not understand that her presence was the source of the chaos. And so they made a decision that would elevate their actions from harassment to psychological torment. They decided to write a letter. This was not a note of apology. It was not a message expressing regret for the fear they had caused. It was a doubling down on the fantasy. In the dim light of their car or hotel room, Julia took a pen and paper and began to write to the woman she had just terrorized. The audacity of the salutation was breathtaking. She did not address the letter to Mrs. McCann. She addressed it to Mom. With that single word, she erased the boundaries of biology and respect, claiming a title that belonged to a ghost. The content of the letter was a distillation of her obsession. She pleaded for love, she pleaded for recognition, and she reiterated her demand for the DNC test that she believed would vindicate her. But it was the signature at the bottom of the page that carried the most chilling weight. She did not sign it with a name she had used for 21 years. She signed it Madeleine. To write that name, to assume the identity of a missing child, and present it to the parents who had lost her, was an act of cruelty so profound it is difficult to comprehend. It showed a total lack of empathy for the recipients. It was the ultimate symbol of the delusion, a piece of paper that tried to rewrite history. With a letter in hand, they did the unthinkable. They returned. Despite the warnings from the police, despite the confrontation on the driveway only a short time before they went back to the house. The risk of arrest was now imminent, but their fixation blinded them to the legal danger. They approached the property again, moving like ghosts through the quiet street, and left the note where the family would find it. This act of returning was the final straw. When the family discovered the note, the violation was absolute. It was proof that the intruders were not going to stop. It was physical evidence that the harasser was still out there, circling the home, watching and waiting. The fear that had sparked on the driveway now hardened into a cold realization that they were under siege. The reaction from the authorities was swift and decisive. The time for warnings was over. The police, who had previously tried to manage the situation with words, now shifted into an operational mode. The leaving of the letter changed the nature of the case. It provided tangible proof of a course of conduct that amounted to stalking. The officers saw the letter not as a cry for help, but as an exhibit in a criminal file. The investigation escalated immediately. Statements were taken, the timeline of the night was reconstructed, and the movements of Julia and Karen were tracked. The authorities recognized that this was no longer just a social media nuisance. It was a significant risk to the safety and mental well-being of the McCann family. The leniency that is sometimes shown to the mentally unwell was replaced by the rigidity of the law. Julia and Karen had believed that the letter would open a door. They thought it would touch the heart of a mother. Instead, it closed the door on their freedom. By returning to the scene and leaving their mark, they had sealed their own fate. They had provided the police with exactly what was needed to move against them. The letter signed Madeleine would not bring a reunion. It would bring a reckoning. The patience of the law had evaporated, and the machinery of justice began to turn, ready to crush the fantasy under the weight of cold, hard facts. The inevitable collision between the fantasy and the law finally occurred. The police, armed with the evidence of the stalking, the harassment, and the unauthorized return to the family home, moved to secure the situation. Julia was taken into custody. The freedom she had used to torment a grieving family was stripped away, replaced by the rigid confines of the legal system. The arrest was not just a physical detention. It was the first time the real world imposed a hard stop on her delusion. She was no longer a celebrity on the internet or a lost daughter searching for a home. She was a suspect in a criminal investigation. With her liberty curtailed, the mechanism to end, the speculation was finally engaged. For months, Julia had demanded a DNC test, using it as a weapon to bludgeon the McCann family. She had screamed for science to validate her, believing that a genetic comparison would prove her status in the hierarchy of missing children. Now that wish was granted, but not on her terms. The test was conducted not to reunite a family in a televised spectacle, but to provide the evidentiary basis for the truth. A simple buccal swab was taken from the inside of her cheek, a painless medical procedure that held the power to destroy a global obsession. The sample was sent to a forensic laboratory, a place where emotions, tears, and stories hold no sway. In the sterile environment of the lab, there were no followers, no likes, and no conspiracy theories. There was only the cold, unyielding logic of biology. The technicians did not care about the interviews on American television or the doctored photographs on Instagram. They looked only at the sequences of the genetic code. They analyzed the markers that define ancestry, the biological footprint that every human being carries from their ancestors. The waiting period was a strange interlude. The noise of the internet reached a fever pitch, with millions of observers speculating on the outcome. But inside the investigation, there was only silence as the machines did their work. Julia waited, likely still clinging to the belief that the results would vindicate her. She had lived inside the lie for so long that she had likely convinced herself that her Polish parents were indeed imposters and that the test would reveal a British heritage. She believed the science would unlock the prison of her life. Then the results arrived. The report was generated, a document of absolute fact. The findings were not ambiguous. They did not leave room for interpretation or doubt. The analysis revealed the entirety of her genetic history. The science spoke with a single definitive voice. Julia was 100% Polish. There was no British ancestry. There was no connection to the McCann family. There was no missing girl hidden inside the woman. The DNC proved that she was exactly who her birth certificate said she was. She was the biological daughter of the parents she had rejected. Every claim she had made, every memory she said she recovered, and every similarity she pointed out in the mirror was proven to be a fabrication of her own mind. The revelation was devastating in its simplicity. The complex narrative of disappearance, of crossing borders at a very young age, of living a secret life It all evaporated instantly under the light of the genetic truth. The distinctive mark in her eye was just a coincidence. The gap in her teeth was just a common physical trait. The feelings of alienation were psychological, not biological. For the authorities, the file was effectively closed. The question of identity which had fueled the harassment campaign was answered. The phantom daughter did not exist. There was only Julia, a woman who had terrorized a family based on a fiction. The scientific dismantling of the fantasy was complete. The test that she had prayed for became the evidence that condemned her claims as false. She was left with nothing but the reality she had run so hard to escape. She was herself, and no one else. The mystery was solved not by a dramatic reunion, but by a sequence of data that proved she had been chasing a ghost that was never there. One would assume that the arrival of irrefutable scientific proof would mark the end of the story. In a rational world, a D&C test stating that a person is 100% Polish and has zero genetic link to a British family would be the final period at the end of a long, chaotic sentence. It should have been the moment the bubble popped, the moment Julia lowered her head, accepted her mistake, and began the difficult work of returning to her real life. But the human mind is not always a rational machine, and for Julia, the delusion had become more than just a theory. It had become the load-bearing pillar of her entire existence. The setting shifted from the sterile laboratory to the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. This was where the facts were laid out, stark and undeniable. The prosecution presented the D&C report, not as a piece of evidence, but as the ultimate silencer. It was the document that stripped away every argument, every suspicion, and every doctored photograph. The jury looked at the paper. The judge looked at the paper. The world looked at the paper. But when Julia took the stand, it became terrifyingly clear that she was looking at something else entirely. Despite the black and white certainty of the genetic profile, Julia looked the jury in the eye and declared that she still believed she was the missing girl. It was a moment that sucked the air out of the room. It was a display of what psychologists call a fixed belief, a conviction so deep and so entrenched that it becomes immune to reality. The D&C test, rather than shattering her fantasy, simply bounced off the armor of her obsession. She tried to argue with the science. She suggested that perhaps the samples were switched, or that the results were manipulated, or that there was some complex conspiratorial reason why her biology was lying to her. It was a desperate, flailing attempt to keep the narrative alive. To admit the truth now would mean accepting that she had terrorized a grieving family for nothing. It would mean accepting that she was not a famous lost child, but a troubled young woman who had hurt people. That reality was likely too painful for her to bear, so she chose to stay inside the lie. The judge listened to this testimony with a mixture of patience and disbelief. The court was witnessing the breakdown of logic in real time. It became apparent that this was not a case of fraud in the traditional sense where a con artist tries to trick others for money. This was something darker and more tragic. Julia was not just trying to fool the world, she had successfully fooled herself. She was the architect of her own prison, and she had thrown away the key. However, the court had to draw a distinct line. While her belief might have been genuine in her own broken mind, the damage she caused was real. The judge acknowledged the cruelty of her actions. The law does not require an offender to believe they are wrong in order to be punished. It only requires that their actions cause harm. And the harm here was immense. The court noted that Julia's refusal to accept the D&C results only added to the torture of the McCann family. It meant that even now, with the science settled, the family could not truly relax because the harasser refused to let go. The tragedy of this was the realization that there was no satisfying conclusion to be had. The family would get justice in the form of a verdict, but they would not get the satisfaction of an apology or an admission of guilt. Julia stood in the dock, a woman defeated by facts, but unconquered in her own mind. She was a paradox, scientifically proven to be a stranger, yet emotionally convinced she was the daughter. The legal system is designed to deal with facts, evidence, and truth. It struggles when faced with a person who rejects all three. The proceedings moved forward not because Julia understood, but because the society around her demanded it. The D&C had done its job. It had proven who she was to the rest of the world. But as she stepped down from the stand, clinging to her shattered identity, it was clear that the science had failed to save her from herself. She was no longer fighting for the truth. She was fighting to remain lost. The legal process is a machine designed to convert chaos into order. For months, Julia and her enabler Karen had generated nothing but chaos. They had turned the internet into a weapon, turned a quiet village into a stage, and turned the lives of a grieving family upside down. But in the courtroom, the noise of the internet holds no power. There are no comment sections, no likes, and no moderators to delete criticism. There is only the law, and on this day, the law finally spoke with a voice that drowned out the delusion. The sentencing hearing was the culmination of the collision between the phantom daughter's fantasy and the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. The judge sat not merely as an arbiter of rules, but as the voice of the victims who had chosen to remain silent for so long. The courtroom became the venue where the true nature of the campaign was defined. It was not described as a quest for identity or a misunderstood attempt at connection. The judge stripped away those euphemisms and laid bare the ugliness of the conduct. In delivering the sentencing remarks, the judge dismantled the narrative that Julia had carefully constructed. She addressed the defendant directly, making it clear that the court saw through the performance. The judge stated that there was absolutely no proper or legal basis for the assertion that she was the missing girl. The claim was identified for what it was: a baseless fabrication that had been allowed to grow out of control. But the judge went further than just correcting the facts. She addressed the morality of the actions. She spoke of the immense suffering that Kate and Gary McCann had endured for nearly 2 decades. She noted that they had lived a nightmare that no parent should ever have to experience. To add to that nightmare with false claims, phone calls, and unwanted visits was described by the judge as unwarranted, unkind, and criminal. The words constant pestering and badgering were used to describe the relentless nature of the contact. The court recognized that this was not a one-time mistake, but a sustained campaign of psychological intrusion. Then came the sentence. The judge imposed a custodial sentence of 6 months in prison. This was the maximum penalty available for the specific charge of harassment. It was a severe statement reflecting the gravity of the harm caused. However, the complexities of the legal system meant that Julia would not be returning to a cell for a fresh term. Having been arrested months prior, she had already served this time while on remand, waiting for the trial to conclude. She had paid her debt in time, but the court was not finished with her. The judge understood that a prison sentence addresses the past, but it does not protect the future. There was a palpable concern that Julia, driven by her fixed belief, might simply walk out of court and pick up her phone to begin the cycle again. To prevent this, the judge imposed a severe and comprehensive restraining order. This was the true steel of the judgment. The order was designed to build an impenetrable legal wall around the McCann family. It prohibited Julia from ever contacting them again by any means. She could not call, she could not write, and she could not visit. She was banned from entering the county of Leicestershire, effectively exiling her from the geography of her obsession. But crucially, the order extended into the digital realm. The judge recognized that the harassment was fueled by the internet. Therefore, Julia was prohibited from publishing or commenting on the case online. The I Am Madeleine brand she had built was legally dismantled. To type the name, to post a photo, or to claim the identity again would be a criminal offense punishable by an immediate return to prison. The judgment also fell upon Karen. While the jury had cleared her of the specific charge of harassment, likely accepting her defense that she was merely a supporter who got carried away, the judge did not let her walk away entirely free of consequence. Recognizing the role she played in facilitating the journey and the confrontation, the judge applied the same restraining order to her. She too was banned. She too was told to stay away. It was a judicial acknowledgement that without the enabler, the harasser might never have reached the driveway. The hearing concluded with a final lingering question: the deportation. Julia was a foreign national, with a criminal record, no visa, and no ties to the United Kingdom other than a fantasy. The Secretary of State would now have to decide her ultimate fate, but the direction was clear. She was being ejected from the narrative she tried to hijack. The gavel came down, signaling the end of the legal drama. The fantasy had been criminalized. The judge had spoken for the family, validating their pain and legally certifying the cruelty of the imposter. The sentence was delivered, the restrictions were set, and the phantom daughter was officially erased by the pen of the court. The obsession that had started with a click on a website had ended with the slam of a cell door and a judicial order to be silent. The gavel had fallen and the legal machinery had ground to a halt, but the silence that followed was not the peaceful silence of resolution. It was the exhausted silence of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. The courtroom emptied, the reporters packed away their cameras, and the world's attention began to drift toward the next headline. But for the people at the center of this storm, there was no simple way to just turn the page. The legal was closed, but the human story was left with jagged edges that might never fully smooth over. Julia's journey, which had begun with a click of a mouse and a surge of adrenaline in Poland, ended in the sterile departure lounge of an airport. The Secretary of State's decision was inevitable. With a criminal record for harassment and no valid reason to remain in the United Kingdom, she was deported. The physical expulsion was the final dismantling of her fantasy. She had come to England believing she was a returning princess, the long-lost daughter of the nation's most famous tragedy. She left as a deportee, escorted by officials sent back to the very life she had tried so desperately to erase. The return to Poland was not a homecoming, it was a defeat. She was returning to the biological family she had rejected, to the parents she had called liars, and to a life she had deemed insufficient. One can only imagine the profound psychological crash that awaits a person when the delusion finally dissolves. For months, she had been Madeleine to millions of people. Now, stripped of the name, the fame, and the followers, she had to face the mirror again and see only Julia. The tragedy of her mental health crisis remained the quiet undertone of the entire affair. A young woman so broken she tried to inhabit a ghost, now forced to live in the ruins of her own reality. Karen, the enabler who had funded the expedition and driven the getaway car, also drifted away. The partnership that had been forged in the heat of obsession cooled rapidly in the shadow of the restraining order. Without the thrill of the chase and the validation of the internet, there was nothing holding them together. Karen returned to her own life, perhaps wiser, perhaps unrepentant, but ultimately separated from the narrative she had tried to write herself into. The team was disbanded, leaving behind only legal bills and a criminal record. But the true weight of this story rests where it always has, with the family in Leicestershire. For Kate and Gary McCann, the deportation of the imposter brought a measure of safety, but it provided little solace. They had successfully defended their home, but at a terrible cost. For 3 years, they had been forced to engage with a cruel absurdity. They had been forced to listen to voicemails from a stranger calling them mom and dad. They had been forced to watch their surviving children, now young adults, be dragged into a spotlight they despised. The ordeal highlighted the unique and terrible burden of their specific grief. Because their daughter's disappearance is the most famous missing person case in modern history, it acts as a lightning rod for the unstable. The family realized that they do not just have to live with the loss of a child, they have to live with the world's obsession with that loss. Julia was not the first person to claim to be their daughter, and grimly they know she may not be the last. The internet creates these monsters, feeding them attention until they grow large enough to step off the screen and knock on the front door. The scars left are deep. The siblings who had fought so hard for a normal life saw their privacy shattered again. The sanctuary of the family home, the place where they should feel safest, had been violated by stalkers who felt entitled to be there. The restraining order provided a legal shield, but it could not repair the feeling of vulnerability. Every time the phone rings late at night or a car idles too long on the street, the echo of those months of harassment will likely return. Yet, amidst the cruelty, the story is also a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. For nearly 20 years, the parents have stood firm. They have weathered police bungling, media vilification, false sightings, and now malicious imposters. They have refused to let the noise of the world drown out their primary purpose. They weathered the storm of Julia, not with anger, but with a dignified, steely silence that eventually won out. They trusted the law, they trusted the science, and they protected their surviving children. As the dust settles, the family returns to their quiet vigil. The room is still empty. The birthday is still missed. The question mark still hangs over their lives. But the phantom daughter is gone. The noise has stopped. And in the returned silence, the family continues to do the only thing they have ever done. They wait, they hope, and they survive. The mystery of the missing girl remains unsolved, but the mystery of who she is not has been laid to rest. The imposter has been erased, leaving the family alone once more with their truth, their grief, and their enduring, unbreakable love for the child who is simply and tragically still missing.